He was born Michael Lawrence Tyler, but the world knew him by another name, Mystikal. A commanding figure in the early 2000s rap scene, he had a voice like a preacher in a storm. Raspy, animated, impossible to ignore. His rise came out of New Orleans, a city that seemed to breathe rhythm and danger in equal measure. Mystikal's energy, his fast-paced delivery, his animated performances, he became the kind of artist who could turn chaos into music. By the time his single Shake Ya Ass hit mainstream radio in 2000, he was a certified star. The Grammy nominations followed, as did collaborations with the biggest names in hip-hop. But behind the blinding stage lights, there was a life that had been spiraling quietly for years. Those who knew him in the early days saw two sides: the professional, perfectionist performer who wanted every verse to hit like a punch, and the man who couldn't seem to let go of anger. Friends described him as charismatic but volatile, someone whose temper could ignite in seconds. Success didn't calm him. It amplified everything that was already unstable. The pressures of fame, the entourage that rarely said no, the constant cycle of money and ego, all of it fueled a dangerous confidence. Mystikal had become the kind of celebrity who believed his own mythology. By 2002, he was one of the South's biggest rap exports. But that same year, his world began to fracture. A woman who worked as his hairstylist accused him of a horrifying act, claiming that he had coerced her into performing sexual acts while two of his bodyguards filmed. She said she had been accused by him of stealing checks, and that what followed was punishment. At first, the public didn't believe it. It sounded like another rumor, another story twisted by envy or malice. Mystikal himself denied everything. For months, he moved as though nothing had changed. But evidence has a way of cutting through noise. A videotape surfaced, one that prosecutors said supported every word of the hairstylist's story. The arrest came swiftly. For someone used to being followed by cameras and adoring fans, seeing flashbulbs replaced by mugshots was a sharp and humiliating reversal. The man who had once stood on MTV stages now stood before a judge, facing charges of sexual battery and extortion. The details of the case were disturbing. Police said he had lured the woman into a trap, accusing her of theft, then used that accusation as leverage. The video evidence left little room for doubt. Mystikal's legal team fought to negotiate, hoping to minimize the damage, but the prosecution's case was airtight. In 2004, he pleaded guilty. The court sentenced him to 6 years in prison. For his fans, it was surreal. Mystikal wasn't some obscure rapper. He was a mainstream success story. To see his name on a prison registry was a shock to an industry already reeling from the loss of artists to violence and scandal. The coverage was relentless. Some radio stations pulled his songs from rotation. Others refused, arguing that art and artist should be separated. But the damage was done. Mystikal's name, once synonymous with energy and swagger, had become shorthand for betrayal and disgrace. In prison, Mystikal's world shrank. Gone were the stages, the crowds, the cameras. His new reality was routine and repetition. For someone used to constant motion, confinement became its own kind of punishment. He later spoke in interviews about how prison forced him to reflect, how it stripped him of illusion. He called it a wake-up call, though even those words felt too small for what had happened. Years went by. The industry moved on. By the time he was released in 2010, the music landscape had shifted entirely. The artists he had once inspired were now at the top. Mystikal tried to return, signing with Cash Money Records, appearing in features. But every attempt at a comeback carried the weight of his past. His interviews were careful, almost rehearsed. He wanted to move forward, but the world remembered too well. Then came another blow. In 2012, barely 2 years after his release, he was arrested again, this time for a domestic abuse allegation involving a woman he had been in a relationship with. He served an additional 3 months in jail for violating parole. Once again, Mystikal insisted it was a misunderstanding. Once again, his name was in headlines for all the wrong reasons. And then, in 2017, an even darker chapter opened. He was indicted on charges of first-degree rape and kidnapping after a performance at a casino in Louisiana. The accusations were severe, and while he denied them, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Though that case was eventually dropped in 2020 after new evidence failed to support the prosecution's claims, the damage to his image was irreversible. For the public, the question became not just what Mystikal had done, but who he really was. Was he the animated performer who gave life to Southern rap? or the man capable of cruelty and control behind closed doors. Fame had given him access, attention, and power, but it had also magnified his worst impulses. In many ways, his story was a reflection of a larger pattern in the entertainment world, a cycle where fame shields bad behavior until it collapses under its own weight. By 2022, Mystikal faced yet another set of charges: rape, false imprisonment, and robbery. This time he was arrested in Ascension Parish, Louisiana, accused of assaulting a woman at his home. Prosecutors alleged that drugs were involved. The indictment painted a bleak picture of relapse and chaos. Mystikal pleaded not guilty, insisting that the woman's account was false, but as the case moved through the courts, his freedom and reputation hung by a thread. Fans who had once waited for his next hit were now watching a man fight to stay out of prison again. For those who remembered his first downfall, it felt like a tragic repeat. Another artist who never truly left the cycle of destruction that fame had set in motion. What made Mystikal's story uniquely haunting wasn't just the crimes themselves, but how they mirrored his persona. His music had always been about control, commanding beats, dominating verses, asserting power. That same instinct, when turned inward, became destructive. In interviews, former collaborators described him as someone chasing redemption, but constantly pulled back by the same shadows that had defined him. Some called him cursed, others called him doomed. But the truth was simpler. Mystikal was a man who never escaped the contradictions that made him famous in the first place. As of now, his legal battles continue. His legacy remains uncertain, a mix of groundbreaking art and unshakable scandal. Younger audiences discover his old music and then Google his name, finding not award shows but court cases. For every listener who still praises his artistry, there's another who refuses to separate the music from the crimes. That duality defines him more than any lyric ever could. The story of Mystikal isn't just about one man's fall from grace. It's about what happens when power, ego, and fame intersect with moral collapse. It forces a question on anyone watching. How much are we willing to overlook when talent blinds us to truth? Because in the end, Mystikal's voice, the same voice that once electrified crowds, became an echo in a courtroom. A reminder that charisma doesn't absolve cruelty, and that the line between performance and reality can sometimes be deadly thin. He came up in a neighborhood where survival was louder than dreams. Christopher Dorsey, known to the world as BG, grew up in the heart of New Orleans, in the uptown streets that shaped some of the hardest sounds in Southern hip-hop. The BG stood for Baby Gangsta, a name he wore long before it became a brand. He was just a teenager when Cash Money Records took him under their wing, recording verses that sounded like a diary written in gunfire and desperation. With the Hot Boys, alongside Lil Wayne, Juvenile, and Turk, BG helped define a sound that turned local block talk into national chart success. Fame came early, but it didn't rewrite his past. It only gave it a microphone. The late 1990s were a new golden era for Southern rap. BG's raspy delivery and no-nonsense flow made him a street poet of a generation that had grown up watching crime rather than escaping it. Songs like Bling Bling and Cash Money Is an Army weren't just hits. They were anthems for kids who finally saw someone who spoke their language, making it big. He went from corner ciphers to music videos with million-dollar cars. The fame didn't change the city around him, though, and it didn't soften the mindset that had kept him alive before success. He still carried the street in his voice, in his habits, and sometimes in his glove compartment. By 2009, BG had built a career that outlasted most of his peers, but his loyalty to the streets that made him had never disappeared. One night that year, it caught up with him. Police in eastern New Orleans pulled over a Chevy Tahoe for a routine traffic stop. Inside were BG and two other men. The officers quickly noticed the smell of marijuana, and when they searched the vehicle, they found 3 loaded guns, 2 of them stolen. None of the men admitted ownership. The situation escalated fast. Everyone in that car knew the stakes. As a convicted felon, BG was forbidden from possessing any firearm. A simple stop had just become a federal case. At first, BG denied everything. His attorneys claimed the guns weren't his, that he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But investigators soon discovered a troubling pattern. A witness came forward, saying BG had pressured one of his associates to take the fall. Federal prosecutors charged him not only with illegal gun possession, but with witness tampering and obstruction of justice. The image of BG as a reformed rapper collapsed overnight. The courtroom painted him not as a misunderstood artist, but as a man who had never really left the life his lyrics described. The case drew national attention, particularly because it touched on the complex relationship between rap and the law. Prosecutors quoted his lyrics in court, framing them as evidence of his criminal mindset. Fans saw it as prejudice, a system that punished rappers for storytelling. But beyond the arguments of art versus reality lay the undeniable fact. The guns were real, the laws were clear, and BG was facing years behind bars. In July 2012, he stood before a federal judge and received his sentence, 14 years in prison. The moment was quiet. There were no outbursts, no bravado, just a man in his early 30s realizing that his fame couldn't shield him anymore. Reporters wrote that he nodded solemnly as the judge read the term. His family wept silently in the gallery. The sentence stunned the hip-hop community, especially in New Orleans, where BG had been a local hero, someone who'd escaped poverty only to be pulled back by it. For many, his story became a grim lesson about how thin the line between the stage and the street really was. In prison, time moved differently. BG kept writing lyrics, sending verses to friends and family. Some were smuggled into mixtapes. Others were read aloud in interviews. He called incarceration a long, cold studio, a place where silence replaced applause. He didn't blame anyone but himself. Over time, he softened. He spoke about wanting to mentor young rappers when he got out, to help them avoid the choices that had cost him his freedom. The bravado that once defined him was replaced by something more reflective, almost weary. "I was addicted to being real," he told a journalist in a letter, "but real ain't worth 14 years. Meanwhile, the world outside kept moving. Lil Wayne became a global superstar. Juvenile found new waves of recognition. The music industry changed completely. Streaming replaced CDs, and rap's center shifted to Atlanta, Chicago, and beyond. Inside the federal system, BG watched from afar as new generations of rappers claimed to live the same life he once did, some of them falling into the same traps. His name remained a legend among the old guard, a cautionary whisper among the new. In 2021, after serving more than a decade, BG was transferred to a halfway house. He was one of the few artists whose career had been put on pause for almost an entire generation. When he finally walked out of custody in 2023, New Orleans welcomed him home like a prodigal son. Cameras followed him through the airport. Fans lined up outside, holding phones, shouting his lyrics. But beneath the celebration there was something fragile. The man they welcomed home wasn't the same one who'd left. He'd missed the rise of social media, the shift of music culture, the deaths of friends and collaborators. He spoke softly now, careful with his words. "I ain't trying to go back," he said. "I paid my price." His release was bittersweet. For years, hip-hop had debated whether BG had been unfairly targeted, whether the system used his fame as an example. But even he admitted that the choices had been his. The gun, the silence, the pressure on others to take the blame. Those were decisions made long before the judge's gavel came down. The prison term had erased whatever illusions he'd once had about loyalty. In his later interviews, he spoke about how the same loyalty that once protected him was the very thing that destroyed him. "Everybody want to be street," he said, "until the street come collect." Now, years later, BG is free, recording again, his voice weathered but still sharp. His new music carries the weight of years spent watching from behind bars, darker, slower, more grounded. There's no boasting, no false redemption arc, just a man trying to find meaning after losing so much time. For younger fans, he's a myth revived. For older ones, he's a reminder of how quickly fame can dissolve into a federal sentence. The irony of his legacy is painful. His biggest hits were about survival, how to stay alive and free in a world stacked against you. Yet in the end, it wasn't violence or betrayal that took him down. It was a moment of arrogance, a refusal to let go of the identity that had once defined him. He had built a brand out of authenticity, but authenticity became his cage. The system didn't make him pick up that gun. It just made sure he paid for it. The story of BG is quieter than others. There's no sensational murder, no shocking conspiracy. But it's haunting in its simplicity. A kid born in chaos grows up, finds fame, builds wealth, and still can't outrun the habits that made him. It's not the story of a villain. It's the story of a man who mistook survival for destiny. Fame didn't corrupt him. It just delayed the reckoning. And when it came, it didn't care about platinum records or Billboard charts. When asked what he learned from those years, BG said one line that stuck with everyone who heard it. Freedom is something you only understand when you lose it. It's the kind of reflection that belongs not just to him, but to anyone who ever thought fame could protect them from consequence. Because for BG, the street never stopped calling, and when it finally answered, it wasn't with applause. It was with the click of handcuffs and the hollow sound of a cell door closing. In the early 1990s, Sacramento was caught between two worlds, the promise of California's cultural explosion and the harshness of its gang wars. It was a city that produced poets and killers in equal measure. Out of this environment came a teenager named Anare Vaishon Brown. To his neighborhood, he was just another kid from the 29th Street Garden Block Crips. To the world, he would become X-rated, one of the most controversial figures in rap history. His rise wasn't built on commercial polish or label hype. It was built on fear, authenticity, and the kind of pain that could only come from living inside violence rather than beside it. He began recording music as a teenager using borrowed studio time and cheap equipment. The lyrics were raw, drenched in local slang and unfiltered confessions. His 1992 debut, Psychoactive, wasn't just a gangster rap album. It was a manifesto. Every song felt like an open case file. He rapped about home invasions, revenge killings, and street politics with unnerving precision. It wasn't fiction. It was reportage from the underbelly of Sacramento. For the young and the angry, he became an icon. For law enforcement, he became a warning sign. At the time, the debate around rap and criminality was already boiling. Politicians blamed hip-hop for glorifying violence. Rappers argued they were simply narrating reality. But when police arrived at a quiet home on Tuxhorn Drive one night in 1992, that argument took on a horrifying new dimension. Inside, they found Patricia Harris, a 42-year-old woman, shot and killed during a home invasion. The crime scene was chaotic. Shell casings scattered, furniture overturned, the smell of gunpowder still lingering. Witnesses said several young men had forced their way in, allegedly looking for Harris's son, a rival gang member. By morning, Sacramento police had names, and one of them was X-rated. Within days, Anare Brown was arrested. The charges: first-degree murder, conspiracy, and home invasion. He was 17 years old. The story spread quickly through local news. A rapper accused of turning his lyrics into action. Prosecutors claimed that his songs weren't just entertainment, but evidence of premeditation. They said his debut album was a confession set to beats. It was a legal strategy that would make national headlines, using music as proof of intent. The trial was surreal. Jurors listened to his songs in court, lyrics echoing through the speakers as prosecutors drew parallels between words and crime. The defense argued that X-Rated's music was expression, that he was painting the violence around him, not committing it. But the timing was damning. The album had dropped weeks before the murder, and some of its lyrics mirrored the crime too closely for coincidence. In one track, he rapped about kicking in doors and getting the enemy's mama. The prosecution didn't have to work hard to connect the dots. What made it worse was that the culture around him fed into the image. Reporters covering the case painted X-Rated as a symbol of moral decay. To them, he wasn't just a criminal. He was proof that gangster rap itself was toxic. The music video footage, the photographs with guns, the interviews where he spoke about keeping it real, all of it became evidence of guilt. In 1996, after a long and contentious trial, the verdict came down, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence, 31 years to life. He was barely out of his teens when he was sent to the California State Prison in Susanville, a maximum security facility. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. But for X-Rated, prison became the next chapter of his career. With no access to recording studios, he began finding ways to make music anyway. At first, he recorded verses through phone lines, splicing them over beats on the outside. Then, with the help of other inmates and smuggled equipment, he recorded entire albums inside his cell. The sound was distorted, the quality rough, but the message was sharp. He called one of his albums Zorcist, describing it as a cleansing of demons, a metaphor for a man trying to rebuild an identity from inside a cage. The industry responded in disbelief. The idea that a rapper could continue releasing albums from behind bars was unprecedented. It made him infamous. Fans saw him as a martyr of censorship, while critics saw him as a manipulator of tragedy. Either way, the myth of X-Rated grew. He was no longer just a local artist. He was a legend of defiance. His songs spoke of confinement, regret, paranoia, and survival, blurring the line between confession and performance even further. For every lyric that expressed remorse, there was another that seemed to revel in the outlaw identity he'd been given. Over time, though, something shifted. The bravado started to fade. In interviews conducted through letters and phone calls, Brown began to reflect differently. He spoke about missing his mother's funeral, about watching his son grow up through photographs, about the numbness that comes from being forgotten. The man who once saw himself as untouchable began to see himself as trapped, not just by prison walls, but by an image he'd created long before he understood its cost. In 2018, after 26 years behind bars, Anna Brown finally walked free. The parole board granted his release, citing good behavior, personal reform, and community support. He stepped out into a world that had changed beyond recognition. Streaming platforms had replaced CD stores. Social media had turned fame into a different kind of currency. Yet somehow his name still carried weight, half legend, half cautionary tale. Cameras waited for him at the gate. His first words were quiet. "I'm not that person anymore." Freedom didn't erase the past. The Harris family still lived with their loss. Their pain wasn't a metaphor or a lyric. It was a fact. But Brown seemed determined to rewrite his future. He started speaking in schools and community centers, talking about responsibility, ego, and the illusion of gangster glamour. His tone wasn't defensive. It was almost weary, like someone who had spent decades thinking about a single decision. When asked if he still believed his music had been used unfairly, he said, "I do. But I also know I gave them the ammunition." Since his release, X-Rated has continued to make music, cleaner, introspective, slower. There's a sense of reconciliation in his work now, as if he's trying to balance two lives that never should have overlapped. The man who once recorded verses through a prison phone is now recording in professional studios again, standing in front of microphones instead of security cameras. But he still carries the sound of prison in his cadence, the deliberate pauses, the contained anger, the constant awareness of time. His story has become a reference point in debates about art and accountability. Should lyrics be treated as evidence? Can a person change after committing an irreversible act? For X-Rated, the answer is complicated. He insists he didn't pull the trigger that night in 1992, but he acknowledges the culture that made it possible, the violence he glorified, the loyalty he prioritized over morality. "I was responsible for the energy I put out," he said in an interview after his release. "And that energy got somebody killed." That reflection is rare in a genre often allergic to vulnerability. It's also what makes his story stand out among musicians who went from fame to prison. His fall wasn't caused by arrogance or excess. It was born from the environment that created him. The music didn't make him a criminal, but it gave him a script, and once he started living it, the ending wrote itself. Even now, years after his release, X-Rated's legacy remains polarizing. To some, he's proof that redemption is possible. A man who turned a prison sentence into a creative resurrection. To others, he's a reminder that art doesn't absolve action. Every album, every interview carries the echo of Patricia Harris's death. The tension between art and responsibility never really leaves him. It lingers in his tone, in the way he pauses when asked about the past. In the end, the story of X-Rated is one of transformation through confinement, but not the kind that erases guilt. It's about a man who built his career on storytelling, and then had to live inside the story he created. It's about how art can save you and condemn you at the same time. For Anna Brown, the price of authenticity was 26 years behind bars, and a lifetime of explaining what real really means. When he performs now, he often closes his shows with silence. No outro, no shout-outs, just a moment of stillness. He says it's for the woman who died, for the mother he never got to bury, for the time that won't come back. Maybe that's what redemption looks like. Not applause, but quiet acknowledgement. Not freedom from guilt, but the courage to live with it. He was born Tamor Trayvon McIntyre, but the world would soon remember him simply as Tay-K, the teenager who turned fugitive raps into real criminal consequences. He grew up in Texas, moving between Long Beach, California and Arlington, Texas, eventually settling into a life that lay between ambition and danger. His childhood was turbulent. Whispers of gang activity, broken homes, and youthful impulses all carved their initial tracks. By his mid-teens, he had adopted a street name, a crew, and a mindset where reputation mattered more than caution. In Arlington, Tay-K found music as both escape and weapon. He experimented with rap, posting tracks online, cultivating a following among kids who resonated with conflict, defiance, and raw honesty. But his music wasn't a distant dream. It overlapped with the streets he still walked, the temptations he still faced. He never fully left the violence behind. Some say he flirted with the criminal world to make his lyrics credible. Others argue the law caught up with a life that had always skirted its edges. The real explosion came in 2016, a home invasion in Mansfield, Texas, where Tay-K and associates attempted to rob a house, escalated out of control. The target was Ethan Walker. In the robbery, Walker was shot and killed. Tay-K was 16 or 17, depending on how accounts are counted, essentially a teenager who now stood at the center of a murder case. He was arrested, charged with capital murder and related counts of aggravated robbery. The case itself became a crucible. Prosecutors argued his involvement, his presence, and the violence were unmistakable. The defense tried to push back, casting doubt on his direct participation in the killing. Over months of hearings, Tay-K became more than a suspect. He became a symbol of teenage criminal audacity in America. While awaiting the trial, something remarkable happened. Tay-K escaped house arrest. He cut off his ankle monitor. He vanished. Then he released a song titled "The Race," a track recorded during this fugitive state, its lyrics weaving his flight from the law into the music itself. The timing was chilling. In effect, he turned the manhunt into marketing. The video went viral. Fans rallied. The authorities intensified the pursuit. On June 30th, 2017, he was captured in Elizabeth, New Jersey, hours after the track dropped. He was transported back to Texas in custody. The lyrics of "The Race," once seen as rebellious flourish, soon became court evidence. In 2019, the trial in Tarrant County unveiled graphic testimonies. Witnesses described Tay-K's presence at the scene, his involvement in the entry, his role in the robbery. Forensic evidence connected bullets and trajectories. Cell phone records and location data painted a narrative. The defense insisted the youth was coerced, manipulated, less culpable. But the jury wasn't convinced. He was convicted of murder, a lesser charge than capital murder, along with aggravated robbery counts. His sentence, 55 years in prison plus additional term for the robbery counts, all largely to be served concurrently. But the story didn't end there, not by a long shot. While serving that sentence, Tay-K faced another murder charge, one that would haunt him even more severely. In 2017, after his escape and while on the run, he allegedly shot and killed Mark Anthony Saldivar in San Antonio. The victim was a photographer lured to take pictures of Tay-K. Prosecutors claimed Tay-K attempted to rob him of equipment before opening fire. One of the witnesses, a former girlfriend, Joanna Reyes, who testified that she helped arrange contact, then saw Tay-K shoot the victim from a car. The narrative burned in public, a rapper gone rogue living his own lyrics. The second trial took place in 2025. The prosecution pushed hard for capital murder, seeking a life sentence without any possibility of parole. The defense argued that the case was built on shaky witness testimony and a shaky chain of events. Ultimately, the jury declined capital murder, convicting Tay-K on the lesser charge of murder. In April 2025, he was sentenced to 80 years in prison, a term that would essentially extend his sentence for life, especially given he was already serving the 55-year term. That 80-year sentence was set to run concurrently, but the wait was symbolic, a public admonition that his second crime would not be forgiven. In court, Judge Stephanie Boyd addressed him. "You are alive. You can better yourself." But for Tay-K, the question was whether those words mattered when the outcome was built into decades of bars. Within this judicial maelstrom, the music world watched with morbid fascination. Tay-K's lightning-fast rise and fall mirrored an extremity rarely seen in modern rap, a star who burned bright and died slowly in prison. His tracks, including "The Race," were scrutinized in courtrooms, debated on social media, and cited as evidence of motive. His legacy became inseparable from his crimes. Since imprisonment, Tay-K has largely receded from public view. There's little indication of artistic rebirth, little public communication. The world that once streamed his songs now catalogs him as a cautionary footnote in music history. Some fans still debate whether he made his own bed, whether a harsh childhood or musical ambition forced his hand. But when all voices fade, the cold fact remains. He is incarcerated for life. For the hip-hop world, Tay-K's story is a bitter paradox. He wanted authenticity, to live what he rapped. Instead, he irrevocably blurred the line between performance and consequence. His ambition, to shock, to challenge, to live dangerously, backfired in the starkest way possible. What his case teaches is brutal. Sometimes the script you write for your public persona becomes your sentence. Fans may ask, was he a product of circumstance or will? But the courts answered, the beats and bars don't excuse the bullets. When you listen now to The Race, that viral anthem of flight, defiance, self-destruction, you hear more than a rapper on the run. You hear an admission, an elegy to youth, and the echo of a sentence that no remix can reverse. In the end, Tay-K's voice is locked away in prison. The music remains, frozen in time, a lament for what fame can cost when ambition and law collide. He was once one of the most celebrated voices in R&B, the man behind anthems that defined the 1990s and early 2000s. Robert Sylvester Kelly, the world knew him as R. Kelly, built his name on soaring vocals, sensual lyrics, and a mystique that blurred gospel roots with dangerous charisma. He sang of love, freedom, and redemption, but behind the stage lights and diamond chains, a far darker story unfolded, one that would eventually land him not in a studio but in a cell. In the beginning, he was a prodigy. Raised on Chicago's South Side, Kelly grew up poor but gifted. He sang in church, busked on street corners, and idolized Stevie Wonder. In 1992, his debut album, Born into the 90s, with the group Public Announcement, hinted at his promise. But it was his 1993 solo breakout, 12 Play, that transformed him into a superstar. Songs like Bump and Grind and Your Body's Callin' crowned him the new prince of R&B. By the late 90s, he was untouchable, writing for Michael Jackson, producing for Aaliyah, filling arenas. Fans called him a genius. The industry called him a hit machine. Few dared to look closer at what was hiding in the shadows. There had always been whispers, rumors of inappropriate relationships, teenage girls seen around the studio, hush money paid to families. In 1994, when he secretly married 15-year-old Aaliyah, the questions grew louder. The marriage certificate falsely listed her age as 18. The union was annulled within months, dismissed as a mistake. Kelly denied it, deflected, and the industry shrugged. His fame was an armor. The radio still played his songs, and fans didn't want to believe the allegations. He released I Believe I Can Fly in 1996, a soaring gospel-tinged anthem that seemed to cleanse his image overnight. The irony in retrospect is devastating. The song was about transcendence, yet his life would descend into a labyrinth of exploitation and control. By the early 2000s, the facade began to crack. In 2002, a video surfaced, graphic, disturbing, allegedly showing R. Kelly engaging in sexual acts with a minor. The tape spread across the country, sold illegally on street corners and online. Chicago police opened an investigation, charging him with 21 counts of child pornography. The public reaction was chaotic. Some fans burned his CDs. Others defended him, claiming conspiracy. Kelly went silent, then defiant. For years, his legal team delayed, filed motions, and challenged evidence. The trial didn't begin until 2008. When it did, the jury acquitted him on all counts, citing doubts about the victim's identification. He walked free, smiling. The applause of enablers drowned out the cries of survivors. But behind that acquittal, more accusations piled up. Former employees, girlfriends, and parents described a pattern: young women groomed, isolated, and manipulated. They were promised music careers but found themselves trapped in psychological and physical cages. Kelly controlled their phones, dictated when they could eat or use the bathroom, decided what they wore. Some were teenagers, others barely adults. Many were cut off from their families. For years, the machine protected him. Powerful lawyers, loyal handlers, a code of silence that kept the truth underground. But in 2017, journalist Jim DeRogatis published an exposé detailing the allegations in the Chicago Sun-Times. The world began to listen again. And in 2019, Lifetime's documentary series Surviving R. Kelly detonated like a bomb. The survivors' voices, trembling, furious, resolute, broke the dam of public denial. The music stopped being an excuse. Soon after, prosecutors in Illinois and New York moved in. Federal indictments followed: sex trafficking, racketeering, coercion, and obstruction of justice. The details were horrifying. In one case, prosecutors described how Kelly and his associates used his fame to recruit girls and women, crossing state lines, subjecting them to abuse under the guise of mentorship. Evidence included text messages, flight records, and witness testimony from former assistants who described a world of secrecy and control. One woman testified that Kelly made her call him daddy and forced her to perform on command. Another said she was locked in a room for days. The courtroom air was heavy, decades of abuse finally confronting daylight. In 2021, after a 6-week federal trial in Brooklyn, R. Kelly was found guilty on all counts of racketeering and sex trafficking. The jury concluded that he had built a criminal enterprise designed to exploit and control women and minors. Survivors cried openly in court. Kelly sat motionless, eyes hidden behind glasses, as the verdict was read. The sentence came in 2022, 30 years in federal prison. The judge called him a predator who used his fame and fortune to prey on the young and the vulnerable. For a man once celebrated as a legend, the fall was complete. And yet, in another courtroom, Chicago, another trial waited. In 2023, he was convicted again, this time on multiple counts of child pornography and enticement. He received another 20-year sentence, most of it concurrent but symbolically irreversible. The empire he built had turned to ashes. The aftermath rippled far beyond the courtroom. Radio stations pulled his songs. Streaming platforms debated whether to remove his music entirely. Fans split into factions. Some nostalgic, clinging to the art. Others disgusted, unable to separate melody from monstrosity. Former collaborators distanced themselves. Even the Grammys, once proud of his contributions, erased him from retrospectives. In Chicago, his hometown, murals depicting him were quietly painted over. The man who once sang of believing he could fly now faced decades of confinement, stripped of freedom, legacy, and the myth of innocence. Inside prison, reports described him as withdrawn, occasionally bitter, occasionally resigned. His attorneys filed appeals, arguing that the trials were biased, that juries were swayed by media hysteria. But the legal tide was too strong. The evidence, the testimonies, the years of ignored warning signs, they were immovable. Kelly became a symbol of something larger, the reckoning of a culture that had protected talent at the expense of truth. His victims, many of them silenced for decades, finally had their vindication. But justice, as always, came late. R. Kelly's story is more than the downfall of a musician. It's a study in denial. It's about how fame can construct walls so thick that even the screams inside them go unheard. His music once filled weddings, churches, graduations. Now each lyric echoes differently, hollowed out by what we know. The transformation is total, from hero to predator, from chart topper to inmate number 09627-035. In the end, R. Kelly's legacy isn't just scandal. It's a warning about the cost of idolatry. He once sang that he could touch the sky. Instead, he fell into the darkest parts of himself, dragging an entire generation's memories down with him. The applause that once lifted him became silence. The kind of silence that follows when truth finally drowns the music. He was a musical architect, the man who built walls of sound that changed how the world heard pop music. Phil Spector was a prodigy, a recluse, a perfectionist, and in the end, a killer. His story began in the Bronx in 1939, under the long shadow of post-war America. His father's suicide when he was 9 carved something deep inside him, a loneliness that would never leave. He moved to Los Angeles with his mother, and by 17 he was already chasing sound as if it were salvation. His first hit, To Know Him Is to Love Him, was both an homage and a wound. The title was lifted from his father's gravestone. The record soared to number 1 in 1958. It was a teenage dream, but Spector wasn't interested in innocence. He wanted control. Through the 1960s, he became a studio visionary, the mind behind the Ronettes, the Crystals, and later, the final work of the Beatles. He invented his own sonic world, the so-called wall of sound, layering instruments until the music felt cathedral-like, overwhelming, transcendent. He was the invisible force behind Be My Baby, You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin', and Let It Be. Everyone called him a genius. Few dared to call him dangerous. Spector's genius came with volatility. He was obsessive in the studio, erratic in life. Those who worked with him spoke of tantrums, threats, and a fascination with guns. He was known to brandish pistols during recording sessions, firing into ceilings to make a point. For years, these outbursts were treated as eccentricity, the price of brilliance. Behind closed doors, however, there was paranoia. He rarely left his mansion without bodyguards. He built a fortress around himself in the hills of Los Angeles, complete with iron gates, security cameras, and the faint echo of a man unraveling. By the 1990s, Spector had all but vanished from public life. The music industry had moved on, but his myth persisted, the recluse genius in the castle of sound. Then, on February 3, 2003, that myth shattered. At around 5 a.m., police responded to a call from Spector's Alhambra estate, known as the Pyrenees Castle. Inside, they found actress Lana Clarkson slumped in a chair by the foyer, a single gunshot wound to her mouth. The .38 revolver lay on the floor near her feet. She was dead. Spector told his chauffeur, "I think I killed somebody." The initial story was murky. Spector claimed Clarkson's death was an accidental suicide, that she had kissed the gun. Prosecutors saw something else. An evening that began with flirtation at the House of Blues, a limousine ride to Spector's home, and an argument that ended with murder. Clarkson, 40, had been struggling to revive her career. Friends described her as upbeat, not suicidal. Spector's reputation for violence, for waving guns around women, became the core of the case. The trial that followed was one of Hollywood's most surreal. The first, in 2007, ended in a hung jury. 10 for conviction, 2 for acquittal. His defense argued that Clarkson's death was self-inflicted. The prosecution called it a pattern of intimidation finally gone too far. In 2009, the retrial began. This time, prosecutors presented testimony from 5 other women who described Spector's chilling behavior. Each story echoed the same rhythm, a night of charm, alcohol, threats, and a gun. When the verdict came, it was decisive, guilty of second-degree murder. Phil Spector, the man who had built the Wall of Sound, was sentenced to 19 years to life in prison. He entered the California prison system as inmate number G63408. The image shocked the world. The man who once conducted symphonies of pop now reduced to a mugshot. Pale, haunted, his hair like a chaotic halo. He was 69. Inside prison, he was treated for bipolar disorder, sometimes withdrawn, sometimes talkative about his glory years. His lawyer said he missed the studio, the perfection of sound, the command. In 2021, Phil Spector died of complications from COVID-19 at age 81, still incarcerated. His legacy remains a fracture. Genius and monstrosity intertwined. The records he produced still shimmer with brilliance. The echoes of the Ronettes still sound immortal, but knowing what followed, they also sound tragic. The same obsession that built his masterpieces may have destroyed him. For decades, the industry protected him, excused the guns, the threats, the cruelty, all in the name of art. In the end, no one could protect him from himself. Spector's story is about how power, unchecked, curdles into paranoia. It's about the thin line between creation and destruction, between genius and madness. He once said, "Everything I touch turns to gold." But when the music stopped, everything he touched turned to silence. In the stillness of his cell, there were no layers of sound to hide behind, only the echo of what he'd done, and the faint memory of the music that once made the world believe in beauty. He was chaos incarnate. A sneer wrapped in leather, a bass slung too low, a symbol of punk's violent poetry. Sid Vicious wasn't born to last. He was born to explode. His real name was John Simon Ritchie, and before the black eyeliner, the heroin, and the notoriety, he was just another lost kid in 1970s London. His mother, Anne Beverly, was a drug user. His father, a soldier who abandoned them early. By the time Sid was a teenager, London was burning with unemployment, anger, and rebellion. He found his place in the noise. In the heart of the punk scene, he met John Lydon, Johnny Rotten, and joined the Sex Pistols in 1977, replacing bassist Glenn Matlock. He couldn't really play, but that didn't matter. Sid wasn't hired for skill. He was hired for image. He was tall, gaunt, sneering, the embodiment of what punk pretended not to care about: authenticity. His bass lines were often played by others in the studio, but on stage, his presence was magnetic, dangerous, pure volatility. When he sneered, "I don't care," the world believed him. Then came Nancy Spungen, a loud, troubled American who had drifted into London's punk underworld. She was addicted to heroin, already lost when Sid met her. Together they formed a dependency disguised as love. To everyone else, it was toxic, catastrophic. They lived in filth, fought constantly, and fed each other's addictions. Their relationship became the dark mirror of punk's self-destruction. The Sex Pistols imploded in 1978 during their U.S. tour. Chaos, drugs, fights, arrests. Sid, barely 20, spiraled. When the band disbanded, he and Nancy retreated to New York's Chelsea Hotel, a legendary haunt for artists, addicts, and ghosts. The room they rented, number 100, became infamous. On October 12, 1978, hotel staff found Nancy Spungen dead in the bathroom, a single stab wound to her abdomen. She was 20 years old. Sid was found wandering the halls, dazed, blood on his jeans. He said, "I did it because I'm a dirty dog," then changed his story. At times he said she fell on the knife. At others, that someone else had been there. The police arrested him for murder. His mugshot, hollow-eyed and broken, became one of Punk's defining images. Youth and destruction fused together. While awaiting trial, Sid was released on bail paid by Virgin Records. He appeared in court wearing a torn suit and a smirk. The press swarmed, the fans glamorized him, but his mind was unraveling. He tried to kill himself several times, slashing his wrists, attempting overdose. He couldn't escape the image he had built, the junkie, the rebel, the murderer. His life was reduced to a caricature that no one tried to save. In early 1979, a small party was held to celebrate his release from Rikers Island. Friends gathered at his new girlfriend's apartment. They listened to records, laughed nervously, and tried to pretend that everything was normal. But Sid had heroin again, brought to him by his mother. That night, he injected himself with a lethal dose. The next morning, he was found dead on the floor, 21 years old. Beside him was a note. "We had a death pact, and I have to keep my half of the bargain. Please bury me next to my baby. Bury me in my leather jacket, jeans, and motorcycle boots. Goodbye." The murder of Nancy Spungen remains unresolved. Some believe Sid killed her in a drug-fueled argument. Others think a dealer or intruder was responsible. The truth is lost in the haze of heroin and myth. What survived was the legend. Sid and Nancy as doomed lovers, symbols of a movement that glorified its own collapse. In the years that followed, films, books, and songs turned their tragedy into pop culture. But underneath the romanticism was a grim fact. Two young people consumed by addiction and fame before they ever had a chance to understand either. For decades, punk fans have argued over what Sid meant. Whether he was a victim of the industry or its most honest product. He had no illusions, no polish. He didn't want to be a role model. But the machine took his self-destruction and sold it back to the world as authenticity. Sid Vicious became the perfect martyr for a culture built on nihilism. The same crowds that chanted his name ignored the hollow eyes staring back. In the end, Sid's fame outlasted his life. His ashes, according to some accounts, were scattered over Nancy's grave in Pennsylvania, though his mother later claimed she accidentally spilled them at Heathrow Airport. It feels fitting somehow that even his resting place is uncertain. Sid Vicious was never meant to rest. He was a flare, blinding, brief, and doomed to burn out. His fall wasn't a mystery. It was a prophecy fulfilled. When you listen now to old recordings of the Sex Pistols, the snarling vocals, the chaos of anarchy in the UK, you can almost hear Sid somewhere in the background, lost in the noise, half alive, half legend. His story isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about what happens when rebellion forgets why it started. Sid Vicious didn't just play punk. He lived it until it killed him. He was one of the architects of rock and roll, the man who made the guitar talk, who turned teenage restlessness into rhythm. Chuck Berry didn't just shape a genre. He practically invented it. From Johnny B. Goode to Roll Over Beethoven, his songs captured the sound of freedom. He sang about cars, love, and rebellion in a language the world had never heard before. But for all his brilliance, Chuck Berry's life would swing violently between innovation and infamy, between applause and prison walls. Born Charles Edward Anderson Berry in 1926 in St. Louis, Missouri, his early life was shaped by segregation and survival. He was raised in a working-class neighborhood, the fourth of 6 children. His father was a contractor and deacon. His mother, a schoolteacher. The young Chuck was sharp, charming, but restless. He loved blues and swing, but also trouble. In 1944, at 17, he and some friends armed themselves with a pistol, stole a car, and went on what police described as a joyride that crossed state lines. They robbed a few convenience stores along the way. When caught, Berry was sentenced to 10 years in a reformatory. He served 3. That early brush with the law carved something permanent in him, the understanding that charm could open doors, but impulse could slam them shut. When he got out, he turned fully to music. By the mid-1950s, he was blending blues progressions with country twang and teenage storytelling. In 1955, he walked into Chess Records in Chicago and recorded Maybelline. The track exploded. Within months, he was touring the country, performing for crowds of screaming teenagers, both white and black, something nearly unthinkable at the time. His songs broke barriers, his lyrics gave rock and roll its first stories. The money poured in. The fame grew. But the same impulsiveness that haunted his youth would soon come back to destroy him again. In 1959, while on tour, Barry met a 14-year-old Apache girl in Juarez, Mexico. He hired her to work as a hat check girl at his St. Louis club. A few weeks later, she was arrested on prostitution charges. When police connected her employment to Barry, he was charged under the Mann Act, transporting a minor across state lines for immoral purposes. The trial was a scandal. Barry claimed innocence, arguing he'd hired her for legitimate work, but the racial undertones were impossible to ignore. A black man accused of crossing moral and social lines in 1950s America. The first conviction was overturned after a judge made racially charged remarks, but the retrial ended the same way. Guilty. Barry was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served about 20 months before release in 1963. When he came out, rock and roll had changed. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones were now the new idols, but both openly credited him as their inspiration. Barry returned to performing, but something had shifted. He was more suspicious, more cynical. He distrusted the industry, the press, and the people around him. He toured relentlessly, often performing without a backing band, hiring local musicians city to save money. He carried a briefcase full of cash and a pistol in his guitar case. The charm that once electrified audiences was now laced with paranoia. Then came another scandal decades later. In 1990, police raided his Missouri estate after a woman accused him of installing hidden cameras in the restroom of his restaurant, the Southern Air. Investigators reportedly found tapes showing dozens of women, including minors, in compromising situations. They also found marijuana. Barry denied intentional wrongdoing but eventually reached a settlement with several of the women. He was charged with possessing marijuana and sentenced to 6 months in jail and 2 years probation. The voyeurism allegations never resulted in a criminal conviction, but they stained what was left of his public image. The rock pioneer who once symbolized teenage freedom was now synonymous with suspicion and scandal. Despite his legal troubles, Barry kept playing, stubbornly, defiantly. Into his 80s, he still performed monthly at a small club in St. Louis, duck-walking across the stage like he had in the 50s, even when his fingers sometimes missed the frets. He had no manager, no entourage, no record deal, just a Gibson guitar, a stack of old riffs, and a legend he carried like a curse. When he finally released his last album, Chuck, in 2017, he was 90 years old. He died that same year, found unresponsive in his home near St. Louis. Chuck Berry's story is difficult to reconcile. He was the father of rock and roll, yet also its first fallen icon. His innovations changed music forever, but his personal failings cast long shadows over his genius. He paved the way for generations of artists, yet he couldn't escape the patterns of self-sabotage that began when he was a teenager with a stolen car. His life was an unending cycle of reinvention and ruin, applause and accusation. Some argue he was a victim of his era, a black man punished harshly by a system that tolerated similar sins from white peers. Others insist the facts speak for themselves, that his crimes cannot be erased by chords or riffs. Perhaps both are true. What's certain is that Chuck Berry embodied the contradictions of American fame, adored and condemned, untouchable yet imprisoned, the embodiment of a dream that was never clean. When the lights dim on his legacy, what remains is the sound, that perfect, urgent riff that started it all. You can hear it in every guitar solo since, the echo of a man chasing freedom faster than the law could catch him. Chuck Berry once sang, "Roll over Beethoven and tell Tchaikovsky the news." The news was that a new kind of genius had arrived, one that could play its way to the top and still fall all the way down. He was one of the biggest names in modern rap, a living symbol of success, excess, and survival. Lil Wayne, born Dwayne Michael Carter Jr., wasn't just another rapper. He was hip-hop royalty. By the mid-2000s, he'd already changed the sound of rap. His raspy voice, relentless work ethic, and wild creativity turned him into a global icon. But beneath the fame, money, and tattoos was a man who had grown up surrounded by violence and mistrust. A man who had never quite escaped the streets that raised him. That past would eventually catch up with him, not in a drive-by, not in a scandal, but in the flashing blue lights of a police cruiser one summer night in 2007. It was July 22, 2007. Lil Wayne had just finished performing at the Beacon Theater in Manhattan. His tour bus was parked nearby when NYPD officers said they smelled marijuana. They approached, searching the vehicle. Inside, they found a .40 caliber semi-automatic handgun, loaded and ready, tucked away in a Louis Vuitton bag that prosecutors said belonged to him. In New York, gun laws are some of the strictest in the country. Just possessing an unlicensed weapon, even if it wasn't fired, could land you in prison for years. The police arrested him on the spot. To fans, it felt surreal. The self-proclaimed best rapper alive, handcuffed on the streets of Manhattan. For Wayne, it wasn't his first brush with law enforcement. He'd been famous since he was a teenager, joining Cash Money Records at just 9 years old, recording with the Hot Boys before he was even 16. His rise was meteoric, but it was born out of chaos. He'd accidentally shot himself in the chest at 12 with his mother's pistol, a near-death experience that became one of the most famous stories in hip-hop history. He survived thanks to an off-duty cop named Uncle Bob, who refused to wait for an ambulance and drove him to the hospital himself. Wayne often spoke about that day as a turning point, the moment he realized he wasn't invincible. But as fame grew, so did his vices. He rapped about codeine, guns, and loyalty to his roots. He was larger than life, but never untouchable. After his 2007 arrest, Wayne's lawyers tried to suppress the evidence, arguing the police had no probable cause to search the bus. But prosecutors had strong evidence. DNA from his hand was found on the weapon. The case dragged on for more than 2 years as he continued touring and recording. During that time, his fame reached a fever pitch. His album, Thaw Carter 3, sold over 1 million copies in its first week, making him one of the best-selling artists of the decade. The irony was almost cinematic. As he was winning Grammys, he was also preparing to go to prison. In October 2009, Lil Wayne stood in a New York courtroom and pleaded guilty to attempted criminal possession of a weapon. He was calm, almost resigned. "I'm a man," he said quietly to reporters afterward. "I take responsibility." He was sentenced to 1 year at Rikers Island, one of the most notorious jails in America. When he surrendered in March 2010, the rap world held its breath. Wayne wasn't just another celebrity being locked up. He was the biggest rapper alive, heading to a place known for its violence, overcrowding, and despair. Inside, he was placed in protective custody for his own safety. He spent 23 hours a day in his cell, allowed out only briefly for recreation or showers. He wrote songs, read books, and kept a notebook full of lyrics that would later appear on the Carter 4. Guards said he was respectful, quiet, and disciplined, traits that surprised many who only knew his public persona. Even behind bars, he found a way to work. He gave phone interviews to radio shows and sent messages to fans through his team. To them, his time inside wasn't just punishment. It was mythology in the making. Free Wheezy became a rallying cry. After 8 months, with time off for good behavior, he was released in November 2010. The day he walked out, hundreds of fans were waiting outside the gates. He went straight to Miami, straight to the studio. Within days, he was back to recording as though nothing had happened. But in his music, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable. He remained a top-tier artist, a mentor to Drake and Nicki Minaj, a living legend in hip-hop. But there was always that reminder that even at the top, the fall is never far away. In 2020, it happened again, this time in Florida. Federal agents found another firearm, again in his possession, a gold-plated .45 caliber handgun, during a raid on his private jet. Because of his prior felony conviction, the charge was serious. Felon in possession of a firearm. He faced up to 10 years in federal prison. Once again, he pleaded guilty. But in a twist few expected, he never served the time. In one of his final acts in office, President Donald Trump granted him a full pardon in January 2021. Wayne thanked him publicly, saying simply, "I want to thank President Trump for recognizing that I have so much more to give to my family, my art, and my community." Lil Wayne's story is one of contradiction, a genius who couldn't fully escape the chaos that raised him, a man who built an empire out of words, yet found himself silenced by bars. both musical and literal. His time in prison didn't destroy him. It solidified his legend. He came out sharper, wiser, and still unapologetically himself. But his story remains a warning. Even the brightest stars cast shadows long enough to reach a cell door. The boy who shot himself at 12 grew into a man who kept shooting for greatness, even when the law tried to take his aim away. For Lil Wayne, prison wasn't the end of his story. It was just another verse, one written in steel and silence. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments.